This episode is brought to you by Progressive, home of the Name Your Price tool. You say how much you want to pay for car insurance, and they'll show you coverage options that fit your budget. It's easy to start a quote. Visit Progressive.com to get started. Progressive Casualty Insurance Company and Affiliates. Price and coverage match limited by state law. Hello and welcome to This Day in Esoteric Political History from Radiotopia. My name is Jody Avergan. This day, September 1947, in the state of Georgia, a special Democratic primary election finally puts to end an almost year-long period that came to be known as Georgia's Three Governors period. Now, one of the most important facts that you need to know, listeners, about Georgia's Three Governors period is that during this period, Georgia had three governors. That's it. I like when a name
captures
it. But look, I got to say, this is one of the most requested stories we've gotten on this podcast. It's been on the list for a long, long time. I went and I searched through my email and found notes from Jacob and Ryan and Carla and Ashton. I'm sure there are more, some going back to like within a month of starting this podcast. People saying, oh, here's a interesting little story. And it is very interesting. And actually, Ashton, in that note that he sent us, actually included a quote from the political scientist V.O. Kellie, who wrote, and I'm quoting here, that not all actors in the Southern political drama have been clowns and knaves may be dismissed as a detail obscured by the heroic antics of those who were. So, yes, this three governors thing really may enforce some stereotypes. I apologize, because there are definitely clowns and knaves and ridiculous behavior all around in the story of Georgia's three governors. Here, as always, to discuss, Nicole Hemmer of Vanderbilt and Kellie Carter-Jackson of Wellesley. Hello there.
Hello, Jody.
Hey there.
Could the three of us be governors of a state together? Would we pull the shenanigans that are pulled in this story?
We could be a triumvirate. Or would we be at one another's throats fighting for power?
Oh, you think we'd get shit done? Good. We wouldn't lock doors and hide guns and all the stuff that we're about to hear about. All right. Well, look, here's a little bit of the backstory, and then we will get into, I think it's kind of broken into, there's an election period, there's the aftermath of that, there's a couple months of limbo, and then there's another sort of 8 months of like real limbo, and then finally the special election that ends it all. But the backstory is that in December of 1946, Georgia Governor Eugene Talmadge, who had run unopposed in the general election, he dies before taking office. So there's this moment between the election and taking office, and it sets off a constitutional crisis in part, and we've said this so many times on the show, because there's just nothing on the books that really specifies who would assume the governorship. And I think one of the things I've learned about American history is that a lot of times people don't write the answer to a question until it pops up and it becomes a crisis. And so Georgia had not really thought through, oh gosh, what happens if someone dies before they're able to come into power? And it really sets off, it's a real Game of Thrones situation. We got to say, right? So who are the contenders, as best you can tell?
Yeah, this story always just kind of tickles me, because you think this would take place in like the 1700s or something like that. But this is like not, in my mind, not that long ago. But so you have Ellis Arnold, who is the outgoing governor. And he's basically like, you know what, I'll just stay a little
Stick around.
longer.
I'm here. My stuff's all here.
Yeah.
But people were not too happy with him, because basically the federal government is pushing to allow more blacks to vote, and he is not pushing back. And a lot of Georgians really wanted him to sort of like keep black voters boxed out from the franchise. So he's not really a contender, but he sees himself as one. Then there is Melvin E. Thomas, who is the lieutenant governor-elect, who you would think would be the next sort of person in line. Usually when the governor's gone, the lieutenant governor sort of takes their place over. That's sort of like how the laws are in the books in other states. And then you have Herman Talmadge, who is the son of Eugene Talmadge. And if this were a monarchy, then that might make sense. But he's like, you know what? I'm my father's son. I'm his heir. I feel like I should just take on this role as governor. I was going to run anyways. We always told Dad not to run. And so he kind of sees himself as the heir apparent, at least biologically. And then there's actually a fourth person who gets in, who is D. Talmadge Bowers. Is there a relationship to?
Yeah, I mean, another random Talmadge sort of throws his hat in the ring
a
little. Yeah.
Feels like Jones or Smith.
The names here are incredible, by the way. Yeah. Ellis Arnold, Melvin Thompson, Herman Talmadge, D. Talmadge Bowers. But basically, we have three, right? We have the outgoing governor, the lieutenant governor-elect, and the son. And all three, to my mind, those are very reasonable sort of pole position slots for this, right? Maybe I'm wrong.
I mean, is the son a reasonable fill-in in a non-monarchy?
We've done episodes on when a wife took over, right? And she ended up being the first female governor of a state. I forget what state that
Alabama,
was. But,
Alabama.
Right, that's right.
George Wallace.
I don't know. You're around.
The son needs
I'm not saying that's where I would vote.
Sure.
But,
Okay. Well, so you have these players, and they do slot into these specific kind of buckets, I guess, and distinct ones, right? Like they have different kinds of claims to the role. One,
I think that's the main point.
Blood relations, one through appearing on the ticket with Talmadge, and then one who's like, again, my stuff's here, so squatters' rights. And so there's an effort to try to figure out whose claim is legitimate. And so in January of 1947, when the General Assembly meets to certify the election, they decide to go with the guy who's never been on a ticket, Herman Talmadge, and he wins 181 to 87. He had the body's political backing. He was seen as a continuation of the Talmadge machine. So the office holders who were invested in that machine were all on board. So he wins.
That's impressive work that the son is the one to get the first kind of rally. It's very succession. But it is, it is nice work.
The problem with it is, as we'll discuss, is that they had no right.
Yeah.
they didn't get to do that.
Key factor.
And the other two guys are like, no, we don't accept the legitimacy of that vote. Thompson, because he was the lieutenant governor-elect, he appeals to the Georgia Supreme Court. He's like, look, the line of succession is that when the governor dies, the lieutenant governor takes over. The timing might be a little off here, but clearly I'm the person who voters wanted in this office. So he goes to the Supreme Court. And Arnold, again, just refuses to leave office. He sits in the office and says he's not going to leave. And so while you have these claimants all trying to work out their claims to this office, one has the General Assembly, one has the Supreme Court, one has his desk, their supporters are fighting tooth and nail. And meanwhile, they're all
physically
setting up
fighting.
Yes. And meanwhile, the office holder, the claimants are all starting to set up their offices in the Capitol. Which is very funny because they're like, well, I'm just going to treat this as though I'm legitimately the governor. And so all three of them are like, okay, I'm the governor's office. No, I'm the governor's office. No, I'm the governor's office. And that's the state of play for a while.
Hey there, Jody here, and I'm very excited to tell you that Wait For It is back for Season 2. Wait For It is one of the newer members of the Radiotopia family, but it is already one of the most acclaimed podcasts around. If I took the time to list every award and best of list that it has been on, we'd run out of time. So I'll just tell you that Wait For It is hosted by Ronald Young Jr., and by the way, Wait is W-E-I-G-H-T, and it tells not only his story, but the stories of all types of folks, fat and straight-sized, who can't seem to keep weight off their minds. This season features stories about grief, fat camp, air travel, as well as conversations with brilliant people like Martinez Evans and Aubrey Gordon of Maintenance Phase. The new season of Wait For It. It's audio storytelling at its very finest, and it launches September 5th. Congratulations to Ronald and the team, and congratulations to all of us for having a new season of Wait For It wherever we get our podcasts.
I can't believe that Talmadge just change the locks. I'm going to get the locks changed. This is my office.
This all goes down in a couple days, a few days in January of 1947. So, the assembly meets, hands it to the son on the 14th. The 15th, basically, the son and the existing governor, basically just, like you said, they just go and sit in separate offices and are like, we're open for business. This is us now. It is, though, the way the supporters behave shows us that this is more than just a kind of like men behaving badly, pissing match power kind of thing. There is like a real political juncture here in 1947 in Georgia. We described some of that. But, I think to the supporters, they really see a lot of very critical questions here. And so that's where there's this sort of skim in addition to all the sort of ego and so forth. I mean, there's some, there's a real kind of like political direction that the state will go in hinging on all of this. Talmadge shows up on the 16th of January, changes the locks on the doors, and it just kind of lingers like that for a little bit. Are there other like twists and turns about the sort of like actual shenanigans that are going on over this week in January?
Well, Arnold, now locked out of his office, goes to the Capitol's information kiosk and sets up his government office in exile. It's basically Avignon, for those of you who know Catholic history. The second pope finds a new home from which to rule. And then after a few days, Arnold backs Thompson, the lieutenant governor, who is going to the Supreme Court and says, we're going to join forces against Talmadge. And that's kind of the state of play until they wait for the Supreme Court to do something.
Right. And so that is just essentially the sort of mechanism here. I do kick it to the Supreme Court, but the Supreme Court takes a while to figure this out. And meanwhile, the shenanigans are going. What's the rush?
Yeah, I know.
Just who's going to govern the state.
But, there's basically 2 months of chaos starting in late January. So, February and March are basically just like the camps have their own offices. Other people get involved here. So, one of the most amazing details is the Secretary of State, this man named Ben Fortson, who is presumably a Arnold backer. He supposedly hid the official seal of Georgia in his wheelchair during this whole fiasco, and which would prevent anyone from signing legislation or performing official actions. There's reports that people were packing, at this time.
Talmadge has got a gun on him, a .38 gun. It's crazy. It's crazy.
And it's not the best look for Georgia, I would say.
Not great.
No.
Yeah.
I'm going to say, though, that Fortson's the real hero, because anyone that would try to be like, let's pass laws right now, that would just be even more chaotic. And so
so hiding the seal is just a way to say, like,
I feel
honestly,
like that's a big deal.
Like it matters that there's not conflicting legislation coming out of the government during this period that then has to be adjudicated. Like, was this illegally done? Was this officially done? But it's a mess. Look, it's a mess. Historians still look back at this, and this is the way one historian put it: Yahooism with an overlay of demagoguery and politics run amok. Which Yahooism. I'm here for that.
Yeah.
Well, I mean, I read that quote from V.O. Kellie in the opening of Clowns and Knaves. And
Yahoos.
Clowns, knaves, and Yahoos. Well, hard not to have a little bit of that judgment when you read some of these details. So finally, March of 47, the Supreme Court says, okay, here's what we're thinking. And they basically ruled that the legislature had basically violated protocol by not looking at the results of the election, instead just handing it to the son. And so then they say, well, look, this guy Melvin Thompson was on the ballot. He's the lieutenant governor. He should be the governor here because he's the lieutenant governor elect, and he takes over for when he should have taken over when Eugene Talmadge died. Herman Talmadge, the son, cedes it to Melvin Thompson. But then they basically say, okay, a special election is going to be on its way. Which brings us back to this moment that we're marking in September. There's another special election, and guess what happens?
I think this is a really important series of events because you do have this chaos that really puts in doubt the governing system in Georgia. And Talmadge steps down. He says, I will respect the court ruling, even though people kind of expected him to challenge it. And then there is, as you mentioned, the special election. And he's like, all right, let's let the voters decide. And he felt very confident about that for good reason, because the voters were like, hey, we like this Talmadge guy.
Yeah, by like 97.5%. That's a landslide. Just like take all the votes, basically.
So after all that, the son does run, and I guess he has name recognition, and he ends up winning after all. And I guess we should ask, what kind of governor does he end up being?
I mean, he's surprisingly more progressive than his father was. His father gets elected basically through the help and assistance of the KKK. But Talmadge does something that I think a lot of people did not approve of in the South, which is after they had desegregated the schools, he ensured that black teacher salaries would be equal to white teacher salaries. And there was this ruse that separated would be equal, but no one really operated like that. There was always a deficit in place. And so by making sure black teachers are paid the same as white teachers was kind of revolutionary in a moment which you could not expect black people to see much progress.
To be clear, he denounced the Brown v. Board decision.
Oh, yeah. Yeah, he's still a racist.
Yeah, but better. So this doesn't necessarily serve him so well in Georgia, but he goes on to be elected to the Senate. Like many white Southern Democrats, he then serves in the Senate for most of the rest of the 20th century. He's there from 57 to 81. So he is one of those fixtures in the Democratic Party for the second half of the 20th century.
Yeah.
Wow. It's crazy. Now I see why there's such a fight, right? Because it's longevity. Mm-hmm. It's like to the death.
So I have downloaded to my computer a 24-page document that is the succession laws of the state of Georgia.
Naturally.
And I cannot for sure tell you what the new plan is, but I can tell you there's a plan. I'm pretty sure the law on the books right now, I gotta really dig in here, but I'm pretty sure the law on the books right now is that the lieutenant governor is sort of the logical next in line in this kind of situation. But then there is a provision for a special election, which is what it kind of ended up being what happened. Mm-hmm. They sort of invented that in real time, but it kind of makes sense, and I think it's logical. But it is, the lieutenant governor does seem to be in pole position, but there is a provision for then we should redo this thing in these special circumstances. So the three governors problem did eventually force Georgia to figure this out.
I mean, in most states, it's the lieutenant governor. Like, that seems to be always sort of the default. But if you don't have it on the books, you better.
But, I get it. But anyway, we really appreciate everyone who has suggested this one. I'm glad we finally got to it. Let's do some also on this days. So also on this day in September 8th in 1943 during World War II, General Eisenhower announced Italy's surrender. Nazi Germany denounced Italy's decision as a cowardly act, and this would start to kind of unravel a little bit in the wake of the final stages of World War II.
And on this day in 1974, Gerald Ford, having just been in the presidency for about a month, granted a full, free, and absolute pardon to former President Richard Nixon that covered all of his deeds and misdeeds in office.
And we've done an episode on that.
And in 1986, this is my favorite one, The Oprah Winfrey Show began the first 25 seasons in national syndication. I still hear the like, do, 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 like the intro song.
Yeah.
In my head.
And so, of course, this is why I wanted to do these also on this day, is because the beginning of the Oprah Winfrey Show, of course, I think listeners know that Kellie did a whole series called You Get a Podcast, which was a sort of smart and historical look at the influence of the Oprah Winfrey Show over the years. So that's out there for you to go listen to. But wait, that music thing, right? Because didn't we do an episode breaking down how the music sort of changed a little bit in those early years?
Yes.
So that's
and
really
how she sang her own theme song.
Yeah, for a bit. Yeah. So there you go. But go check out You Get a Podcast, because that is some brilliant work. All right. That brings us to the end of the episode. Nicole Hemmer, thanks to you as always.
Thank you, Jody.
And Kellie Carter-Jackson, thanks to you.
My pleasure.
Radiotopia. From